London, 1832. The air was thick with fog and the smell of coal, curling around the gas lamps that lined the narrow streets like ghosts refusing to leave. It was the kind of morning where the city seemed to breathe, slow, damp, and indifferent. In the heart of Smithfield Market, a crowd had gathered not for cattle or grain, but for a spectacle that could only exist in a society that believed morality was a matter of class. A man stood beside a wooden post holding a rope, and at the other end of that rope stood a woman, his wife. The noise of the market dimmed into a strange hush before bursting again into laughter and mockery. The man raised his hand, his voice rough with ale, and shouted that he had a wife to sell. Coins clinked, boots shuffled, and someone shouted a bid. No priest, no papers, no mercy, just an exchange. When the rope changed hands, so did a life. The new husband smiled, the old one walked away with a few shillings and a pint of beer, and the crowd went back to their business as if they had witnessed nothing unusual. But this was not a joke, not a drunken dare, not even an act of rebellion. It was a ritual. In Victorian England, where the law, the church, and society worshipped the idea of decency, a man could sell his wife in public, and people would call it custom. Beneath the layers of lace, etiquette, and sermons about virtue, there lay a truth so cold that it shamed the word civilization itself. A woman was not a person, but property. The law said so. Until the late 19th century, when a woman married, her existence merged with her husband's. She could not own land, could not sign contracts, could not claim custody of her own children, could not keep her own wages, and could not even refuse him her body. She was legally absorbed, her identity dissolved, her name replaced by his. In the eyes of the law, she was a chattel, a movable possession, no different from livestock or furniture. And so, when marriages rotted, when love curdled into poverty and despair, when the husband wanted freedom or simply revenge, there was only one way to end it without the impossible cost of a legal divorce. Sell her. The custom of wife-selling had roots deep in the soil of England's working class, where men and women were trapped by laws written by the wealthy and morality dictated by the church. Divorce required an act of Parliament, a process so expensive and bureaucratic that only the upper classes could afford to end their misery respectably. A factory worker, earning a few shillings a week, had no chance. So he turned to the marketplace, the only court he knew. The act followed a bizarre ritual that society pretended to understand. The husband would lead his wife, often with a halter around her neck or waist, through the town's busiest square. Crowds would gather, some out of curiosity, others out of morbid amusement. The man would announce her age, her virtues, her faults, and the reason he wished to be rid of her, then open the bidding. Sometimes the buyer was a stranger, sometimes the wife's lover, sometimes even her rescuer. The prices varied, from a handful of coins to a year's wages, from a loaf of bread to a pint of ale. The moment the money changed hands, the transaction was witnessed, and the woman walked away with her new companion. It had no legal standing, but in a society ruled by appearance and gossip, that didn't matter. Once the sale was public, it was socially binding. Neighbors accepted it, priests ignored it, and the authorities looked away. To the men, it was a poor man's divorce. To the women, it was humiliation disguised as freedom. For some, it was an escape from cruelty, a chance to leave a drunkard, a gambler, or a brute without becoming a beggar. For others, It was degradation beyond words. There are records of wives weeping as the crowd jeered, of children clinging to their mothers as they were led away like cattle. One woman, sold in a market in Yorkshire in 1832, was bought by her lover for 1 shilling. The crowd cheered as though it were a love story, not a public execution of dignity. The newspapers wrote about these incidents in the same columns as harvest reports and horse races. They described them with a kind of smug amusement, calling them curious customs of the lower classes. To the upper class, wife-selling was not cruelty. It was entertainment, something to gossip about over tea. But to the poor, it was a last resort in a life already strangled by poverty and hopelessness. The Industrial Revolution had turned England into a machine that consumed human lives. Men labored 14 hours a day in factories thick with smoke. Women washed, cooked, and bore children in crumbling tenements. Wages were low and hunger was constant. Marriage, meant to be a refuge, often became another chain. A man unable to feed his family saw his wife as another burden. A woman beaten and starved saw the market as her only way out. In many cases, the sale was agreed upon by both parties. They would stage the event, ensuring witnesses, and even plan the buyer's identity. It was an absurd attempt to dress desperation in ritual. The wife would put on her cleanest dress, tie her bonnet neatly, and stand beside her husband as he called for bids. Sometimes, the new husband would pay not to the man, but directly to the woman, an act that, while symbolic, gave her a strange sense of control in a world that denied her everything else. There is one account of a woman named Mary Chudley, sold in 1835. Her husband, a butcher, led her to the marketplace and announced her for sale for 5 shillings and a terrier dog. The crowd laughed. Bids began. A pint of gin, 6 shillings, a silver chain. Finally, a farmer offered 10 shillings. Mary smiled, curtsied, and left with him, while her husband returned to the tavern with his payment. Years later, it was said that she lived contentedly with her new companion. It sounds absurd, almost comic, but it was not comedy. It was survival. For many women, being sold was the only way to leave a marriage alive. Still, for every Mary, there were hundreds who suffered in silence. There were women dragged to the market against their will, beaten when they refused to smile, mocked by neighbors, and branded for life by shame. The halter, often tied like a leash, was both a symbol and a sentence. Some markets even specified rules. The sale must be public, the woman must consent, at least in theory, and a witness must be present. It was barbarism with etiquette. And the church, the self-proclaimed guardian of morality, stood silent. Priests thundered against adultery, but said nothing about the sale of a wife in broad daylight. To them, it was a matter for the lower classes, a social curiosity rather than a moral crime. The government, equally complicit, turned away because the law offered no alternative. The poor had no access to divorce courts, and enforcing morality among them was a problem the elite did not wish to touch. Thus, the grotesque theater of wife-selling became an accepted part of rural and industrial life. Children grew up watching it. Men joked about it in taverns. Songs were written about it, and slowly, what began as desperation became tradition. That was the true horror, not just the act, but the normalization of it. When sin repeats long enough, it becomes invisible. When cruelty wears the mask of custom, it feels like order. Victorian society congratulated itself on progress while ignoring the pain at its foundation. Women were told to be pure, obedient, and silent, while men were taught that dominance was a virtue. It was a world obsessed with propriety, yet rotting with hypocrisy. Public hangings were abolished as barbaric, yet wife-selling continued in open daylight, without shame. By the mid-19th century, as reformers began to question the moral fabric of Britain, the cracks began to show. Feminist voices, mocked and ridiculed as mad women, started to speak out. Writers and activists like Carolyn Norton, who herself suffered under the cruel marriage laws, wrote essays exposing the absurdity of treating women as property. Newspapers that once printed wife sales for amusement began to print them as evidence of moral decay. The public mood shifted, but change was slow, and law slower still. It took decades of debate and protest before Parliament passed the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, granting wives the right to own property, keep their earnings, and exist as legal individuals. It was a revolution written in ink rather than blood, but for many, it came too late. Generations of women had already lived and died as shadows of their husbands. Their names appear only in parish records or court documents, their lives reduced to footnotes and curiosities. Even after the law changed, the stigma did not vanish. The memory of wife-selling lingered in whispers and anecdotes, in jokes passed down in pubs, in the uneasy silence of families that remembered too well. Historians later tried to sanitize it, calling it a folk custom or working-class eccentricity. But the truth refuses to be buried. It was organized humiliation born from oppression. It showed that morality without compassion is just cruelty in costume. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of the story. In those foggy markets, amid laughter and coin, human beings revealed something timeless: the tendency to disguise injustice as tradition, to call exploitation necessity, to turn suffering into spectacle. When we read about those sales now, it is easy to feel superior, to believe we have evolved, but the ghosts of that market still whisper. They remind us that every age has its own version of the rope, the auction, the price tag placed on human dignity. In the end, the tale of Victorian wife-selling is not just a story about the past, it is a mirror held up to every society that claims virtue while tolerating quiet cruelty. London moved on, but the cobblestones still remember. Beneath the traffic and the chatter, beneath the polished surface of modern England, lies the echo of a crowd's laughter, the rattle of coins, the low voice of a man announcing the sale of his wife. It is the sound of a world that believed ownership was love and silence was virtue. It is the sound of civilization applauding its own decay. By the time the century turned and Queen Victoria's reign began to wane, the air of England had changed, but its conscience had not. The factories still coughed smoke into the sky. The cobblestones still carried the echo of boots and bargains, and though wife-selling was fading into rumor, its ghost remained in the faces of women who had once been sold, exchanged, or quietly abandoned. Some now worked as laundresses, some as servants, some as beggars, outside the same taverns where their fates were once auctioned off. Society congratulated itself on progress, the railways, the telegraph, the empire stretching across oceans. But inside the parlors and factories, the chains had simply changed form. Women were no longer sold at market, but they were still traded in subtler ways, for security, for social standing, for survival. Marriage remained a contract tilted toward men, and morality continued to be a mask stretched over the bruised face of hypocrisy. The newspapers that once reported wife sales began printing stories of fallen women and ungrateful wives, warning that female independence was a moral disease. Men wrote essays about the sanctity of womanhood, defining it as obedience wrapped in virtue. Even literature romanticized suffering: the patient wife, the forgiving mother, the angel in the house. Society adored its martyrs, especially the ones who never spoke. But in the shadows of drawing rooms and factory floors, something was stirring. The women who had tasted humiliation had also tasted truth, and truth, once swallowed, never leaves quietly. The suffrage movement was not born in Parliament. It was born in those markets, in the whispers of women who had stood beside posts and halters, who had seen the price of their own existence weighed in shillings. When they spoke, their words were not polite. They were raw, furious, and alive. They began forming reading circles, gathering in back rooms of pubs or candlelit kitchens, sharing pamphlets and forbidden books. But it grew, steady as fire in dry grass. By the 1880s and 1890s, the clamor for women's rights had become impossible to ignore. Still, for every speech in London, there were 100 silences in the countryside. The working-class women who had lived through the age of wife-selling rarely joined marches or signed petitions. They did not have the luxury of politics. Their rebellion was quieter: a refusal to kneel, a decision to teach their daughters to read, to save their own coins, to marry on their own terms, or not at all. The true revolution began not in Parliament, but in the kitchen, the mill, and the mind. Each small act of defiance cracked the facade of Victorian order a little more. Men complained that the world was changing too fast, that women were forgetting their place, that families were falling apart. But what was really falling apart was illusion: the illusion that power could be permanent, that ownership could be mistaken for love. The British Empire prided itself on civilization, yet in its colonies, it preached the same lies it once told its own women. In India, Africa, and the Caribbean, entire nations were treated as possessions: land as wife, resources as dowry. The logic was identical: control dressed as duty, dominance disguised as care. The moral rot of wife-selling was not a local shame. It was a blueprint for empire. And just as women eventually rose against the tyranny of the household, colonies rose against the tyranny of the crown. The two revolutions were twins, born of the same wound: the hunger to be seen as human. As the 20th century dawned, photography began to capture what words had hidden. Faces of factory girls, street vendors, widows, and servants filled newspapers, and the image of female endurance became impossible to romanticize. Reformers like Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters turned outrage into organization, chaining themselves to railings, shouting from courtrooms, enduring imprisonment with pride. They did not fight for novelty. They fought to erase a centuries-old shame: the belief that women could be exchanged, silenced, or owned. The law had changed, but the mindset had not. And they knew that the battle for equality was not just political, it was spiritual. They demanded not only the vote, but respect, and in doing so, they dragged the memory of wife selling into the light of modern consciousness. For the first time, England was forced to look itself in the mirror and admit that its most horrific custom was not a footnote in history. It was the foundation upon which its polite society had been built. Still, even as reform triumphed, memory clung like smoke. The descendants of those women carried stories their mothers whispered at night, stories of shame that turned into warning. Some said their grandmothers were sold, others said given away, others refused to speak at all. The halter became a symbol not of bondage, but of survival. And in that transformation, humiliation turned to heritage. There was a strange kind of redemption. The daughters of the sold became teachers, writers, and voters. The granddaughters of the auctioned became nurses in war, poets in peace, and leaders in the world that once denied them a name. The rope that had once marked ownership now hung as a reminder that no chain lasts forever. And yet, history has a cruel sense of humor. The wife is no longer sold at market, but modern society has found subtler auctions. In magazines, women's bodies are still priced in beauty. In corporations, their worth is still discounted in pay. In marriages, expectations still whisper the same commands dressed in softer words. The stage has changed, but the script echoes. The Victorian market has become the digital marketplace, the shouts of the crowd replaced by the clicks of a million unseen judges. And though the currency has shifted from coins to attention, the question remains, what is a woman's freedom worth in a world that never stops bidding? Imagine then one of those women from the 19th century. Her dress faded, her eyes lined with soot and sorrow, standing in today's world. She would not recognize the machines, the screens, the noise of cities, but she would recognize the hunger for validation, the fear of loneliness, the illusion that worth must be earned by pleasing others. She would see that the rope is gone, yet the need to be owned still lingers in hearts trained by centuries of submission. She would walk among us and perhaps whisper, "You are freer than we were, but not as free as you believe." Because freedom is not granted by law. It is claimed by consciousness. The women who were sold had no choice but to become symbols of endurance. The women who came after must decide whether to become symbols of change. In the quiet corners of old English towns, some of the taverns where wife sales once took place still stand. Their walls, repainted and polished, hold no plaques to memory. Tourists pass through sipping ale, unaware that beneath their feet lies the dust of 1,000 forgotten tragedies. But the earth remembers. History, like soil, absorbs everything: the laughter of the crowd, the shame of the sold, the silence of the priest. And sometimes, when the wind blows through those alleys, it sounds almost like a sigh. It is not the wind, it is memory exhaling. The ghosts of the past never truly vanish. They just learn to whisper softer. Every civilization that has ever existed has its market, the place where it trades its conscience for comfort. In the Victorian era, it was the literal marketplace. Today, it may be the marketplace of fame, wealth, or conformity. The lesson of wife selling is not confined to gender or time. It is a parable of how easily humanity learns to price what should be priceless. The halter around the neck of the Victorian wife was only a reflection of the invisible halters that still bind people today. Halters of expectation, fear, and the desperate desire to belong. The faces have changed, but the pattern remains. As the fog of history clears, one question lingers in the air like incense after prayer. Who among us would stand in the marketplace today and refuse the price? Who would tear the rope instead of adjusting it? That, perhaps, is the truest measure of civilization. Not how beautifully it builds its cathedrals, but how courageously it breaks its chains. And so, the story of those women ends not with pity, but with warning. They were not simply victims of their husbands, They were victims of a belief system that taught everyone to confuse obedience with virtue. But from their humiliation grew rebellion, and from rebellion grew change. The women who were sold for shillings bought with their pain the currency of modern freedom. They were the silent architects of a world that would one day speak for them. Their names are forgotten, their graves unmarked, but every right enjoyed today, every vote cast, every voice raised, every refusal to be silenced is an answer to their suffering. They are gone, but their story remains, not buried in textbooks, but breathing in the unspoken courage of those who dare to say no. Perhaps that is the final irony of history. The same markets that once reduced women to objects gave birth to the voices that would destroy those markets forever. The same society that tried to erase them ended up being rewritten by their defiance. And somewhere in the endless noise of the modern world, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the sound of a rope snapping, not in pain, but in liberation. The echo fades, but the meaning endures. No one truly sells a wife. They only sell their own humanity. The Victorian man who raised his hand in the marketplace believed he was freeing himself from a burden, but he was chaining his soul to history's shame. And though centuries have passed, that single act of cruelty continues to ask us the same question it asked him on that cold morning in London. When faced with injustice, will we be the crowd that laughs or the one that walks away? In the end, the tale of wife selling is not about men or women. It is about what happens when empathy is traded for convenience, when dignity becomes negotiable, and when a society mistakes its cruelty for order. The markets are gone, the fog has lifted, but the mirror remains. Look into it, and you may find not the face of a Victorian man or his wife, but your own reflection, staring back through time, silently asking, what would you sell to feel free? And perhaps that is where the story truly ends, not in the past, not in the market, but in the human heart, where every age must decide whether to carry the rope forward or finally let it fall.